We want to have this conversation because we know there's an awful lot of hype around making. And there's an awful lot of hype around the maker movement. And we also, as a set of practitioners who are delivering at different types of environments in different types of ways, know there's an awful lot of impact. And the hype doesn't always match the impact. And the hype sometimes detracts from the impact. But there's some very real, interesting impacts of making and of maker culture that we'd like to kind of delve into as a panel. One of the things that we find quite often is that we're talking about making and we're talking about manufacturing and we're talking about cultural things, and they're quite abstract. And we don't necessarily have ways of understanding and describing them out there in the wild. So I think one of the things we need to address today is what kind of a thing is maker culture? What kind of a task can it do? What are the things it is good for? The other thing we kind of need to recognize, and that's kind of come across really strongly with Wayne's introduction, is that making is an emotional and a political issue. How and where you make things is deeply, deeply embedded into a sense of place. It's deeply embedded into an emotional sense of identity, and also changes the nature of the things you can make. So the infrastructure of how and where you make things changes the flavor of your products. You know this, you have Eubank. You kind of, as Blackburn, you have a sense of the types of things you can and can't make here. But one of the things with the hype around making and with the framing of makers as the next revolution is that we have to practice an element of responsible futuring. That if we're going to tell stories about how Blackburn is the place that, or if we're going to have a festival of making, we need to be able to deliver on those stories as well. We can't just tell fancy stories about the future of making at the same time as offshoring all the things. We need to be able to match up and practice responsible futuring and enable positive conversations that include all members of a society, not just the ones who can call themselves makers, or can call themselves manufacturers, or can call themselves designers. So the world of maker spaces in particular, but also the maker movement more generally, has some quite significant futures pinned on it. And pinned on it is probably the right term, because some of these things makers themselves will say, many of them other people will pin onto them. So there's people who've said that the maker movement will solve the world's health problems. These are actual headlines from actual newspapers like the Financial Times. And that's quite a big claim to be pinning on making and manufacturing. And the maker movement will emerge as the dominant source of livelihood. Again, quite a big thing to be pinning on making. And it's not necessarily that these promised futures aren't one part of our collective future. It's that the hype detracts from the actual real impacts. One of the troubles with identifying impacts when you're talking about something that's slightly amorphous and that changes what it is to adapt and adapts to its environment is identifying the impacts becomes challenging. And you notice that one meerkat is bigger than the other ones, but you might not notice that the ones that look similar but actually are quite different. So one of the things we want to tackle in this panel today is, what's that gap? Can we articulate what the gap is between the perception of making, the hype and the conversations that we're having about possible futures where we all make, where we all have access to manufacturing infrastructure, and the reality? So what is happening? What can we evidence? And what sort of unexpected impacts have we witnessed within our lives and professions as makers, but also as makers of makers and as places and people that support this new type of infrastructure?